How's it going, everyone? My name is Kyle Tryon from Depot, the lead senior developer advocate, and I'm here with Mark from OpenMeter. Mark, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. We have some really cool stuff to share today. Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My name is Mark. I am the head of open source at OpenMeter. I'm also the founding engineer, so I'm kind of involved in everything that involves engineering productivity, backend infrastructure stuff. So I'm trying to focus on our open source strategy these days and, things like engineering productivity. So that's why I'm involved in topics like CI, which is our topic for today.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about this blog post you wrote. I'm going to ask you a few questions before that, but it was a really interesting blog post. We saw it over at Depot. Depot is mentioned in this blog post, of course, but we saw the title is very eye-grabbing, How We Made Our CI Pipelines 5 Times Faster. And I want to go through your journey of how you did that and how you broke it down. I think you did an excellent job breaking it down. But even before we get into that, I kind of want to ask a little bit of a setup question. Can you tell me a little bit about OpenMeter and maybe what type of pipelines you were running, and we'll get into the types of issues that you came across that needed solving.
Sure. So OpenMeter at its core is a usage metering service. We provide usage metering solutions and a bunch of other solutions now, but it started out as a usage metering solution. And we initially focused on AI companies. Like we had a bunch of AI startups at the early days where they didn't really want to focus on the usage metering part. They just wanted to focus on their core business. And we made it easier for them to go from zero to billing. That was our kind of the headline of what we did. And these days we are working on a bunch of other things. Like we're working on entitlements, we are working on credits and credit enforcement. We are working on a billing system right now. So we are kind of expanding the portfolio, but it started out as a usage metering solution.
And am I correct? This is an open source solution as well?
Yes. So the core project is open source, and we are trying to move everything back to the open source project as we can. And obviously, there is a hosted version as well, because we use things like Kafka and ClickHouse, and people usually don't want to host those themselves. So we are trying to make things easier for our customers by hosting the whole infrastructure and the entire solution for them.
Yeah, that absolutely makes perfect sense. So tell me a little bit about, at some point, of course, all of us here, we have some kind of CI pipeline we need to run through. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about the CI pipelines that you were running into, and were you always on GitHub Actions? When you came into the company, were they on GitHub Actions, or how did we get there? And slowly, what kind of issues did you start to see that led to the blog post we're going to go into?
Sure. So, well, from day zero, we used Dagger. We actually used Dagger before we had GitHub Actions. We had the Dagger, an initial very simple Dagger pipeline to build the application. I'm really a huge fan of Dagger. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Yeah,
I guess
absolutely.
you are.
We're actually big friends of them at Depot too. On like a side note, the founders
Yeah,
are
so I
all
heard.
buddy.
Yeah, so I heard. So we used Dagger from day zero. We didn't even have GitHub Actions. We just needed a solution to, build and test the application, maybe push a couple of container images, and then over time we added the GitHub Actions pipeline. But the entire CI pipeline is coded in Dagger, and GitHub Actions is basically just the execution environment for the CI pipeline.
Yeah, great. So for the folks who maybe aren't as familiar with Dagger, we'll do a quick explanation. Probably not doing it full justice. I apologize to the Dagger folks, but for folks who are like more familiar with GitHub Actions as it is currently, the way that you write your CI pipeline is, well, it's kind of split. You have the YAML orchestration, which is the definition of the pipeline, and the code execution. Again, kind of split, but a lot of that is done through GitHub Actions, which are largely written in JavaScript. They could also be Docker containers in rare instances. But you're orchestrating that all through YAML and kind of whatever YAML spec comes with GitHub Actions, as opposed to Dagger. And maybe you can do a better example for me, but Dagger operates off an SDK where it's executing code as you define it. And that can be done in a multitude of different languages, but that allows you to replace the YAML portions of your config with true code, which actually then in turn executes true code. So we're no longer relying just on JavaScript. Most of the time you're going to be using Go. Is that what you guys use, Go?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what most people are going to end up using, and that lets you test your pipeline. It's more deterministic. It fits in with all of the flow that you as a developer already know. It's all the same linting tools. It's all the same dev environments and things like that. And not to mention, you're not necessarily learning some external DSL. I like GitHub Actions YAML, to be completely fair, but it's still unique, right? It's not just YAML. There's a lot of weird and interesting if statements and things in that YAML that's not really conducive to static YAML
Yeah.
config. But we can do that with real programming languages with Dagger.
Yeah, and really the core idea is that basically these pipelines that you write in a programming language that you're already familiar with, it's portable. So you can run it on your own machine. You can run it on GitHub Actions or any other CI. And in case you have to move to another CI solution, you don't have to rewrite the entire DSL, CI-specific DSL to another version. And yeah, in the startup world, that happens more often than not, that you have to move between CI solutions. But it's also good because you can run the entire pipeline on your own machine. And
Which I love.
It basically eliminates the so-called push and pray. The Dagger folks coined that phrase, and I really like it. It completely eliminates the push and pray, where you make a change, push it to GitHub, wait for the CI to become triggered, wait for the pipeline to run, and then try to figure out what went wrong and go through the whole feedback loop, which is a long feedback loop over and over again. You can do that locally, which is fantastic. Since Dagger basically packages everything into containers, that makes it already portable. So
yeah, and Dagger itself isn't actually shipping that much on top of your code. Realistically, there's a small SDK in there. There's some concepts in there that I'm not going to go too deep into because I think I'll probably speak on them. But for the most part, you're just running your code. Dagger is more or less a framework around that. And I think also it may be important to mention to some folks, and I'd be curious to know how you were using Dagger before integrating with GitHub, because Dagger, while it provides a pipeline, does not necessarily provide all of the functionality that a lot of CI providers like GitHub Actions provide. There's things like statuses, obviously anything that goes into the Git flow, but how are you going through your deployment process without that higher level CI? You were just using Dagger at one point.
So we did a couple different things. First, we have like this giant CI pipeline that runs everything. And the problem with that is it's quite long, takes a lot of time. Obviously, with caching, it takes less time, but it's really hard to pinpoint where things go wrong. And I think the Dagger folks are working on making that experience better. But for now, what we did, we basically, alongside that giant long pipeline, we also run some of these smaller subsets of the pipeline as separate GitHub Actions jobs. So we get separate checks for those calls. So we have one for tests, we have one for linters, and it's much easier to figure out what went wrong by going to that one specific step and go through the logs and figure out what needs to be fixed. But of course, you can still run the whole thing locally. So if you're doing it right, you will catch it locally, and then the CI, GitHub Actions will actually be always be green. So,
all right, so let's go a little bit further in your timeline here. You start using Dagger with GitHub Actions, but you're noticing some problems. What kind of problems?
Yeah. So obviously, as it is always with CI pipelines, as we add more and more stuff to the software, add more and more tests, add more and more components, we noticed, I don't know, around January, that the CI pipeline started to get slow. And as I mentioned, we have this one giant single pipeline that runs everything. And it started to become slow, and we didn't really know why. And it took us a long time to figure things out. But and this is like, if you go through the blog post, there are two key highlights. One, you need to get caching right. And caching is, caching means two things in Dagger. One is the so-called layer cache. That's very similar to how Docker's layer cache works. And the other one is things like cache volumes that you kind of get natively with most of the CI
Hmm.
solutions out there. Like when I say cache volumes, it means things like package manager caches that you mount into containers as you run things.
And if you're
And
familiar with like GitHub Actions, that'll be like the setup Python, setup node. They're all using the
yeah,
actions/cache action, which on GitHub is using Azure Blob Storage on whatever other CI provider, and we'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. Could be whatever it is they're doing. I don't know exactly what Dagger's doing. I'm going to make a guess. It's probably something AWS related, probably S3 ish related.
well, they do Dagger Cloud, so that's where their distributed cache service or implementation is. I'm guessing it's AWS.
Somewhere in the cloud. It's Dagger Cloud though. That's
Yeah,
their provided solution. Here we go. If you scroll a
but
little further in
but
your post.
that's the other side of caching, and basically we need to get all of those right. Things like, as I mentioned earlier, we have separate pipeline jobs running. Those sometimes overlap, but they use the same cache volumes, and they sometimes stepped on each other's toes, so we need to separate those volumes. But it was a lot of trial and error until we figure out how to optimize not just the layer cache for each build. For example, at some point we had time.now fairly early in one of the pipelines, which basically busted the cache and
Yeah.
everything that came after.
So
And
you got
once
the
we
basic
figured that out,
types of things, and then
yeah,
more basic things like optimize your Docker files and things like that to
yeah,
make sure that they're not busting. But then other things a little bit more complicated because you were accessing the same volume from multiple different projects. I'm going to say in this case, you had one type of test busting the cache for another type of test.
yes.
Beautiful, yeah, very very nice. And so that's when you started to see with those two efforts combined, you're starting to see a lot more cache hits.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the first thing we realized basically was that, well, A, jobs were taking a lot more time, and B, that it was really hard to figure out that there were no cache hits. We basically figured it out based on the amount of time it took to build binaries, for example. So it was a kind of, again, a trial and error process to figure out that it was actually a cache miss. Once we figured out that there were cache misses and tried to optimize things, we noticed a considerable reduce in build times.
And I can see here you got a pretty consistent run from a standard 25 minutes, which I assume is still with caching attempted but not optimized. And then we got it down to 10 minutes with the cache optimization.
Yeah, and at this point, we also threw in a few larger GitHub Actions runners. Like initially, since it was an open source project, we used the free ones, and one of the first attempts to optimize the build time was to, well, just buy larger runners from GitHub Actions.
Of course,
but that didn't really do anything. Like,
really,
yeah.
That's actually surprising. I guess what I'm going to make a guess. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'll have to double check what all of the CPUs are, but you probably got more cores, but not necessarily faster cores, which in your workload wasn't all that useful.
Yeah, that's one thing, and I also think that on the IO side, though, I don't actually know what types of runners they run, but I think on the IO side, it may not be that performant.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking recently for a different blog post, trying to find out what the specific specifications are of the GitHub Actions runners. Unless it is somewhere where I was not able to find it, which is entirely possible. It's interesting that I don't believe GitHub actually documents specifically what the specifications of the runners are. They will tell you the number of vCPUs, the amount of RAM, and the amount of disk space, but you don't really get any information beyond that.
I couldn't find it either.
Oh, so you've looked. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine, to give them benefit of the doubt, I imagine they do update it somewhat frequently, and perhaps they, maybe they update it frequently enough that they don't choose to update the documentation. Maybe they don't want us to know. I don't know. The point is that information isn't very easy to get. Just this morning, I was running some benchmarks, not too dissimilar from yours. I may have taken some inspiration. We'll get to those in a minute. But over at Depot, we actually just we share with you the exact AWS instances, EC2 instances that we're using. So it's very easy to look it up,
Mhm.
benchmark, do things like that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about benchmarking in a minute.
Yeah, I also talked to other people actually, and they had similar experiences with the GitHub Actions runner. So they also had IO issues. So it was fairly easy to come to the conclusion that the IO may actually be the problem, and we needed to look elsewhere for a solution.
All right. So at some point, we discovered the larger GitHub Actions. They're not really working as intended. Where did we go from there?
So by the time we managed to bring the build time down to around 10 minutes, we were looking for an alternative solution, and around the same time, Dagger published a blog post about their CI setup, and they use it works quite well for them. But if you take a look at the blog post, look through all the components, it's quite a lot of work to build something up from the ground, similar to that. And
And they were like
they use
self-hosted,
Argo CD.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Like at this point, we kind of decided to go self-host something. We were prepared to do some sort of a POC. We were still researching. We found Arc, which is kind of the go-to self-host solution for Kubernetes-based shops on EKS, or I think it probably works on GK as well. I'm not sure, but we are on AWS, so that would have worked for us, except we knew it would be a lot of work. And they published this blog post, and I was like, they use Argo CD, we use Flux for everything. So if I have to port everything to Flux, it's gonna be a lot of work. I mean, but I was fully prepared to do that. I just didn't have the time, and that's where we came across Depot.
As someone who is a big fan of open source and self-hosting, and I imagine you are as well, very often is my instinct to try and self-host something or run it locally. And I think it's one of those things where you also have to think about too, how much time are you going to spend maintaining this thing,
Yep.
fixing this thing? Not to mention, like, there's the one-time cost doing your conversion from Flux to Argo. That's a big project. But what I think, especially in like smaller situations, but I think what a lot of smaller groups of dev teams don't necessarily think of up front is, yes, we can save money by implementing this in our much cheaper infrastructure, get it self-hosted. But they're not thinking about the extra people that are going to be needed to maintain that thing going forward. It's never just set up and let it run. We try, we get really close, but
Yeah.
it's not quite ever going to be push and play. That's why we have managed services.
Especially for a small company like ours, like we are 8 people or 9 people at the moment. So time is very expensive.
Very much so. And it just makes sense. I've become one of those people where I try very hard to get a subscription to something as long as it makes sense. And I think on that note, that's one of the interesting things that you found out in this post was it just makes sense. You did the math,
Yep.
and there's really no debating. It just makes sense. So you were looking at self-hosting. You said, okay, that's really, really complicated, possibly expensive if you look at it in terms of maintenance and things like that. And that's when you came across us over here at Depot. I'll give the folks a little run through. Hey, we're at depot.dev. We have two main products. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go in, but the big one that we're obviously really well known for is our remote Docker builders. So you can build Docker images directly through our remote build kit instances, which have enhanced accelerated Docker layer caching, helps you build your images up to 40 times faster, as well as what we're going to talk about right now, our GitHub Actions runners, which are designed to be very similar in scale, size, label as what GitHub offers. However, they are stronger, more powerful machines. We'll go into that in a moment. And they are considerably cheaper. So it's very, very easy for you to take the runner that is currently in your GitHub Actions workflow, simply replace it with the Depot one and immediately get faster and cheaper builds. And that's what you found out, Mark. So I love that you shared everything you found out. We're going to really get into the interesting stuff here. So as it says in your post here, you started your POC when you came across Depot. And we see here you changed, just as I mentioned, you changed your runner from the GitHub large runner and moved it over to, what is that, our 8-core, right? So you still actually use one of the larger ones. I'd be curious to know how it runs. Even
Well,
on
we actually, yeah. So it was really impressive that it really just took 5 minutes to replace the official one with the Depot one, and it was really easy to get started with the POC. So that was really impressive.
That's the great thing. And the other thing that some folks may not know, you're using Dagger. So that's fantastic. For some of the folks who maybe are just on GitHub Actions, which is kind of interesting too, is we actually hijack, I'm going to say, the GitHub Actions cache. So if you're using actions/cache, whether that's through like setup Node, setup Python, anything like that, that actually uses Depot's cache under the hood as well, which is pretty interesting. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that. Don't you worry. But I love this chart you put together. I'd love for you if you could give me an overview here of what we're looking at.
Yeah, so we basically what we tried is, well, it was a little bit more complicated at the end than just replacing the runners. We actually made the workflow into a matrix workflow, and we ran a bunch of these different runners. We ran the same workflow with a bunch of these different runners, and we gathered the metrics. And this is what you can see in this table. So we basically ran the same workflow with all those 4, 8, 16, and 32 cores, and we compared that to the GitHub 8-core one.
And I see.
And as you can see,
yes.
Yeah.
Now that makes sense. Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, so we did that for a week, I believe. And then we just basically averaged the duration of those builds and picked. I think we are running on a 16-core right now because that felt like a good compromise. Like 20 more seconds isn't gonna make a difference.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So these two are fairly equivalent. They would have the same label, except that one would say Depot and one would not say Depot. And in this particular run, it's exactly half the price, as well as roughly 40% faster. Does that sound about right?
Yep.
Yeah. And these, fluctuate a little bit depending on which runner you're on and which workflow you're running. But I've run some tests personally. I'm actually about to put out a blog post as well that supports roughly the same thing. You're going to get, no matter where you are, roughly, no matter which runner you're on, you're going to see roughly half the price, and I'll say also roughly half the build time. I've also seen in particular it all comes to, it's all part of your build time, but the network speed specifically is also roughly 45-50% faster as well. So working with that cache is an interesting part, which we're still going to talk about because I know you're using Dagger cache. So we'll go into that, but that's fascinating. So at this point, you have no real decision making to go through. You've decided this is an instant win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, in any case, I think we are actually using the 16-core Depot runner for the larger pipeline, and as you can see, it's the same price as the GitHub larger one, but it's half the time. So it's basically half the price as well.
Yeah, I love when you can. I was telling someone this recently, but it's really interesting when you don't have to sell this, right? This is not a sales pitch. This is a graph that will tell you if you replace this with that, you will save this much time or this much money or both, depending on what combination of things you were running. So that is fantastic. I'm glad that you were able to put this together and had the time to run these tests, because this is really, really useful stuff. And as I was telling you earlier, inspiration to me. I'm going to be putting out a blog post later, kind of based on some of your findings here. So that's fantastic.
And it still took much less time than building the POC and our custom building infrastructure.
Cost savings all around. What would it have cost to build the POC, to maintain it later, everything like that. So yeah, amazing stuff. I'm really glad that you shared that. I thank you for answering all those questions. That was
Yeah, of
fantastic.
course.
At the end of the day, let's get the summary here. Combination of Dagger Cloud and Depot allowed us to dramatically accelerate our CI pipeline, cutting build times from 25 minutes to just 5 at the end of all of this, while also reducing our costs by 50%. And we can attribute that largely, one way or another, to cache optimization and more powerful slash cheaper accelerated runners on GitHub Actions. Two very, very simple things to do. You took your existing workflow. It sounds like you didn't modify it that much at all, and you were able to see massive, massive savings and increases in speed. Does that sound right?
Well, it took us some time to
Okay.
figure out some of the caching issues, but at the end of the day, well, it was worth it because
Absolutely.
we cut costs. The pipeline, the same pipeline, essentially the same pipeline, became much faster. So it was a long road, but it was worth it, and hopefully others can just follow in our steps and spend much less time
I'm
figuring this
already
out.
following your example. I appreciate that. Let me ask you, and if you have nothing lined up, don't worry about it. But what's next for this saga? Are you already looking at any other new features, or are we on to the next project, which would be totally fair?
Yeah, we are always extending the pipeline itself, and it's always interesting to see how that affects performance. Like, do we have to split things out into separate runs? So right now, what I'm trying to, well, I have two projects lined up. One, we have a couple end-to-end tests that always ran in a separate pipeline. I'm trying to bring that back into the fold, if you can say. Like, I'm trying to integrate it back into our one giant CI pipeline to see how that works and if it affects performance at all. And the other thing I'm trying to do is writing end-to-end tests for our Helm charts. So that's kind of the next thing. And hopefully I can run all these in a single run, because that would mean whatever you change in the pipeline, it's going to make sure, or not the pipeline, the software,
Mm.
the pipeline is going to make sure that it works end to end from the basic tests to the deployment part. And we'll see how we can optimize those. Like, maybe they will have to be separate pipelines. I'm not sure, but we'll see. One thing that would be interesting to see, maybe this is a feature request for you, is if the Dagger guys implement custom cache providers. It would be really interesting to see if you could implement your own cache provider and use like your custom depot cache magic to further improve the cache pipeline. Because right now, I'm not sure if you know how the cache volume part works. The layer cache obviously is just a regular, it's like a registry. But the cache volume, right now, Dagger actually downloads all of the cache volumes, all of them in your organization, regardless if you need them for that specific pipeline. And that's kind of annoying because we have quite a few different jobs. And which means it always downloads even the ones that we don't use. So if Dagger ever releases an API for custom cache providers, it would be interesting to see an implementation with Depot.
I'll give you a little preview. I probably shouldn't say, but it's coming soon. It's fine. Eventually, in the near future, Dagger will run natively on Depot, kind of in the same way that GitHub Actions runs on Depot. So you'll be able to use Depot as the build engine for your Dagger pipeline in the near future. So we'll see what that comes with when it comes to the cache situation. I'm also going to throw your way two suggestions, two things I'm going to leave you with. One, I think you might be interested in the last live stream we did, where I spoke to the creator of a new CLI called Yoke. Yoke, not Yoke. Yoke like a steering wheel for an airplane.
Okay.
His CLI, the whole concept is you don't have to, but you can translate your Helm charts into Go using just the Helm Go packages, and you compile them to WASM, and then you apply them with the Yoke CLI. So you can put all of your Helm charts into something that is akin to your Dagger pipeline. It's Go, it's testable, it's all of those things. And one of the other cool things with that particular CLI is you don't actually have to write all the WASM and everything. You can actually just take the Helm chart and put it right in. So there's an easy way to kind of slowly transition over. Would recommend. I'm going to send you the link. It's in our last live stream for anyone who's watching now.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Beautiful.
Sounds
The other
good.
thing I'm going to send to you is our RAM disk runners. We have a few different names for them. We're going to land on a good name here in a moment.
So
Yeah.
are those with the IO
Yes. Yeah.
suffix? So
Exactly.
I've actually tried those. I can send you the numbers. I've excluded them from the blog post, but I do have the numbers, and it didn't really make a difference.
That's interesting. I think it's I'm like surprised and not surprised at the same time, because I think it highly depends on specific scenarios. We have numbers of like particular users where they saw dramatic increases, but I think it's one of those things where you're going to have to experiment, just like you did, and find out, is this something that actually benefits here? Because one of the other things too with these IO runners is you actually trade RAM for the RAM disk, right? So like cost wise, alternatively you could get a machine with more RAM, which may be more beneficial for your particular workflow. So I think it's a good idea what you did. And I think what other people should do is run a matrix, put it through a few different runners. You're only going to do that 2-3 times to get a little bit of a background info on how it's going, and select what is fastest, cheapest for you. It's a good idea.
Absolutely. And it's easy to do. And I actually wonder, like, I want to give it another go. I wonder if it's just a configuration thing on the RAM disk nodes. Like, do I have to configure something to make sure that the Docker volumes go to the RAM disk? I'm not sure. I haven't really looked at them. I just added
work,
them to the matrix. I guess it should just work.
It should.
And
but I'm happy to look at it with you anytime you want. We can always take this off.
it would be interesting to see if it's really just a configuration issue. But I can send you the numbers, and in some cases, like the IO optimized runners actually perform worse than the
it could be
non-IO
the less
optimized
RAM against the other one, which will have like double the RAM because we're using half of that as the IO runner. So yeah, it could happen. I could totally see it.
Yeah.
I would like to see the numbers. Let's take a look at those, and
Sure.
maybe we'll figure something out too. But
Okay.
glad you're able to find a solution. Mark, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to have all of the links to everything we talked about, especially this blog post, down below. Mark, is there anything interesting going on at OpenMeter you want to share with us?
Not from the top of my head. I mean, we have a couple releases coming up, but they are not public yet, so I don't think I can talk about them.
We'll send them over. They can always check out.
One thing we are planning to do is release a few more blog posts about our pipelines. Like, once we finish the Helm end-to-end test one, it's going to become a blog post as well. And we're trying to, since we've been using Dagger from the early days, we have quite a bit of experience with it. So we're trying to, share some of the cases that we have with Dagger. So watch our blog.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be there. I'm going to have the links to your blog down below, links to other videos, everything we talked about down below. Or actually, I think YouTube's moving it to the right. So either there or there, wherever it is. I'll see you in the next one. Mark, thanks for joining us again. I am Kyle T over at Depot. You can find us at depot.dev. Join us on Discord, all of the fun things, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Have a good one, everyone.